Yeah. I need everybody to break their neck for the first time ever. Rock the Bells Visionary VMA Awards for me. Yeah. Break your neck for me, people. Yeah. Here we go now.
See me what you really want to do.
Come here, Ma.
Talk to me. You look like you really give it to me. I'm putting what you're talking. I'm putting trying to walk for me. Then when you really try to put it on the car. You really like I never did before for me. Then when you break your back and I break your neck.
Come on.
Tell my people that.
Okay.
That's y'all. One time when I lock it down and I hit you with that.
With what?
Y'all people know all day we've been making the drops. Y'all people know every time we come through this mother. We be y'all back taking the box.
So let me blow the deep.
Y'all people know when we come, we've been making it hot. We've been making the flop. We make a brother wanna stop. Y'all know what time it is. Come on. Hey, come on. Yeah, what a surprise. I see you something, make a brother cold.
Open your eyes.
All my people getting money.
Capitalize.
Y'all little small guys.
We on the rise.
If it's
Back to mine.
if you quit, you know we coming for supplies. Got a big gun and I'ma show you the size. I saw that nigga in my flip phone.
Family time. Me and my homies, we coming through, talking you out. Killing off any and everything you talking about. See you in the club, I be walking you out. Should've thought twice when you would have opened your mouth. Yo. Anyway, we say keep it moving. With the homie, know what you doing. Now blame me, all of my homies the same. It's not a lame, making names still split in your brain.
Enough.
Give me some more. Your people wonder why is.
Give me some more. Where the weed at? Give me some more.
You know we always need that.
Give me some more. Even though you getting money, you can give me some more.
We got the cars in the big crib.
Give me some more. Everybody spread love. Give me some more.
And if you like it, let me hear you say.
Give me some more. We about to take it back. Get out your seat.
Here we go. Scenario.
As I combine all the
From the mind now.
Heal up,
Bring it back over. Why now?
powerful impact.
Boom.
From the Canada, ragged.
Hey.
Gotta be my mind.
It's a lesson now.
Vocabulary.
Very necessary.
When taking it back.
My life very sick.
Oh my God.
Oh my God.
Eating I toast do like the what?
Keep the charge singing. All over the track, man.
Try to be fun.
As I come back.
Touch it, bring it, pay it, watch
Hands in
it,
the
turn
air.
it, leave it, stop.
I want you to touch the sky.
Bring it, pay it,
Hands up,
watch it,
right now,
turn
let's
it,
go.
leave it, stop, format it.
Bounce. Come on. Bounce. Come on. Bounce. Come on. Bounce it to me. Bounce. Come on. Bounce. Come on. Bounce. Come on. Get low, boss.
Who be the king of the sound? Bust it, bust back, they just put a lock.
Lock in the town.
A lot of my people be coming
For
from
miles around.
See, they be coming, but they know how to go.
Turn it up.
Now you know who holding the throne.
Give me a crown.
People so loose in the trap.
Give me a pound.
I don't really mess with you, dude.
The dude's a clown.
Making the women strip it through the hill.
5 boroughs of death.
Yeah.
You don't understand.
Yeah.
I got New York City in the palm of my hand. Now I can make a tight fist and let it crumble ridiculous.
Ridiculous.
Or I can smack the world with a New York.
Turn it up.
Staten Island on my piggy Queens on my tough dudes.
What?
The Bronx on my middle finger screaming. Rock ice in Manhattan so they the ring finger. You know I had to keep pulling on the trigger finger.
Touch it, bring it, pay, watch it, turn it, leave it, stop it. Touch it, bring it, pay, watch it, turn it, leave it.
A
Touch
little
it,
louder.
touch it, bring it, pay.
Touch it, bring it, babe. Touch it, bring it. Hey, yo, this is what I just gotta do. Hit you with no defense of what you saying, y'all.
Let's go.
Silly with a 9 milli, what's the dilly, yo?
Yeah.
When I be on the mic, yes, I do my duty, y'all.
Come on.
While up in the club like we while in the studio.
You don't wanna violate, baby, really and truly. Main Thug, villain, and Julio.
He booty, yo.
Type of brother that'll slap you with the Julio.
Yo.
Real shook skin to death. Look at shorty, she your little cutie. When she shake it, make me wanna get all in her.
Booty, yo.
Top man, stretch it to banging misses.
And video now.
While I'm with my feet like we up.
In the freak show now.
Hit you with this shit, make you feel it all in your
Toes now.
Got on my people.
And we're cold now.
Start on my metaphors when I form my lay my
Let's go.
balls.
If you don't know, you messing with lyrical player pros.
Hey, you wanna party with me?
Let me see that's what you got.
Gorilla.
Put your hands on my eyes to see.
Bamboos.
Straight pop, bottle in the place to be.
Yes.
If you really wanna party with
Jordan
me,
Lucas.
let me see that's what you got for me.
Mr.
Put your hands on my eyes to see.
Yes, straight
Pop, bottle in the place to be.
Let's go.
If you really wanna party with me,
Ain't got we trust.
don't this hit make my people wanna. 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 Buster,
What's up, son?
see the girl rolling,
I can't hear y'all.
And it look like
What up, Pat?
your ass is just swollen.
I see their ass getting big.
and if your man baby sitting there, say what we gon' say.
Yo,
What we gon' tell her? We gon' tell her, girl.
Pass the Kabasi.
And we gon' tell her